Within the Reference Guide to Regulatory Compliance, I'm reading Expedited Funds Availability Act. The Expedited Funds Availability Act was a part of the Competitive Equality Banking Act of 1987. The EFAA requires banks to make funds deposited into accounts available within certain specified deadlines. The EFAA is implemented by the Federal Reserve Board's Regulation CC, Availability of Funds and Collection of Checks. Regulation CC sets forth time deadlines by which a bank must make deposited funds available. Temporary deadlines, which expired in 1990, allowed for longer maximum time periods before funds had to be made available. In September of 1990, the permanent maximum time periods became effective. The EFAA also gave the Federal Reserve, the Fed, the authority to regulate the check collection system. An efficient check collection system is important to the goal of making funds available to depositors. Regulation CC specifies endorsement standards and describes the responsibilities of certain parties within the check collection system. In 2003, Congress enacted the Check Clearing for the 21st Century Act, commonly called Check 21. The purpose of the law is to expedite check processing by facilitating the electronic processing of checks. Specifically, Check 21 gives the paper reproduction of a digital image of a check, a substitute check, the same legal standing as the original check itself. The Federal Reserve Board issued regulations in 2004 to amend Regulation CC to implement the changes required by Check 21. As electronic fund transfers continue to increase each year due to greater acceptance of internet-based payments and the use of debit cards, check usage continued to decrease. This trend has prompted the Federal Reserve Board to consolidate its check processing centers. As of February 27, 2010, only one Federal Reserve Bank processed checks for the entire country. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland processes checks with routing numbers, effectively making all checks local for Regulation CC purposes. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, enacted in July of 2010, raised the amount of money required to be made available on the next business day from $100 to $200, effective on July 21st of 2011. Also in 2010, the Federal Reserve issued a proposal to eliminate non-local references within the regulation and to modify the model disclosure forms. This proposal also would shorten the number of days for exception holds and require electronic hold notices if the customer agreed to receive them. As of the publication date, this proposal was not final. Coverage. Under the reg, all accounts for the purposes of the availability rules, an account is a transaction account which generally includes accounts at a bank from which the holder is permitted to make transfers or withdrawals by negotiable instruments, telephone transfers, electronic payments, and so forth. It generally does not include time deposits or savings accounts. For purposes of the rules for substitute checks, an account includes any deposit at a bank, including a demand deposit, transaction account, savings deposit, or time deposit. Business days include all calendar days except Saturdays, Sundays, and federal holidays. What neglected to be said was that business accounts are also included. Availability rules. Subpart 2. The next day availability is afforded to cash deposits, electronic payments, and certain checks. Cash deposits, if made in person to a bank employee, if not made in person to a bank employee, then the second business day after a deposit is the date of availability. Electronic payments must be available the next business day after the payment is received. Payment is received when the bank received both the payment and finally collected funds and the information on the account to be credited. Certain checks. A. Checks drawn on the U.S. Treasury and deposited in the payee's account. U.S. Postal Service money orders deposited in person to a bank employee and into the payee's account. C. Checks drawn on a Federal Reserve Bank or a Federal Home Loan Bank deposited in person to a bank employee or into the payee's account. Checks drawn by a state or local government in the same state as the bank deposited in person to a bank employee to the payee's account using a special deposit slip if required by the bank. E. Cashier's checks, certified checks, or teller checks deposited in person to a bank employee and into the payee's account using a special deposit slip if required by the bank. F. $200 or the aggregate of any deposit made by the customer, whichever is less, that is not subject to next day availability. G. Checks deposited in a branch of the depository bank and drawn on the same or another branch of the same bank if both branches are located in the same state or same check processing region. Items that would be subject to next day availability but are not deposited in person may be available for withdrawal on the second business day after the day the funds are deposited. If the bank requires the use of special deposit slips, they must be provided by the bank, or the bank must inform its customers of how deposit slips may be obtained. Subpart 3, Availability Schedule. Second business day availability. The following items must be available for withdrawal by the second business day following the banking day on which the funds are deposited. Those are local checks, checks drawn on the U.S. Treasury that are not subject to next day availability, checks drawn on the U.S. Treasury and deposited at a proprietary ATM, U.S. Postal Service money orders not subject to next day availability, and checks drawn on Federal Reserve banks, Federal Home Loan banks, and state and local governments, and cashier's certified and teller checks that are local checks and not governed by the next day availability rules. Under the local checks, number 1, there's a couple of sub-points here. Checks payable by or at a local paying bank, or a check payable by a non-bank payer through a local paying bank. Local paying bank is a bank located in the same federal check processing region as the physical location of the bank branch or proprietary ATM where the check was deposited. In the case of a deposit at a non-proprietary ATM, the deposit is a local one if the account is at a branch located in the same federal check processing region as a non-proprietary ATM. Note, the Federal Reserve Board has proposed amendments to eliminate references to non-local checks. The proposal was not final as of the publication date. So B, the fifth business day availability. The following deposits must be available for withdrawal not later than the fifth business day after the banking day on which the deposits were made, and that would cover non-local checks, checks payable by, through, or at a non-local bank, and a non-local bank is one not located in the same check processing region as a depository bank. 2, checks drawn on the Federal Reserve banks, Federal Home Loan banks, and state and local governments, and cashier's certified and teller checks that are non-local checks and not governed by the next day availability rules, and 3, at non-proprietary ATMs. Here's what I don't understand is why these deposits must be available for withdrawal not later than the fifth business day after the banking day on which the deposits were made. For instance, what are Federal Reserve Bank, Home Loan bank checks, and state and local government and cashier certified and teller checks that are local checks and are not governed by the next day availability rules? And why are they in the next day availability section, or the second business day availability section, and also the fifth business day availability section? Extensions of time for cash withdrawals. Banks may extend the availability time period for cash or other similar withdrawals on deposits of local and non-local checks by 1 business day, provided that up to $400 of the deposited funds is made available by 5 p.m. on the day that the fund would be made available under the schedule. The $400 this $400 is in addition to the initial $100 availability, which is actually $200. Cash withdrawals over this amount, that is, over the initial $400, can be delayed until the next business day. A bank may continue to limit withdrawals on ATMs to amounts under $400. D, other time extensions. Banks may have a 1-day extension for any time period on deposits that are deposited into the account of the bank or branch located in Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and by a check drawn on or payable through a bank not located in the same state as a depository bank. Does not apply to no-hold items. Exceptions. In certain instances, a bank does not have to follow the time schedules for funds availability. In these cases, a bank may extend the time periods established for funds availability. This is new accounts. An account is new if it has been open for 30 days or less, unless each of the customers on the account has other transaction accounts at the bank that have been open for at least 30 days. Exceptions also involve cash and electronic deposits into new accounts, and they must be available by the next business day. The first $5,000 of deposits into the payee's account of checks drawn on the U.S. Treasury must be made available on the next business day. Amounts over $5,000 must be made available no later than on the 9th business day following the banking day of deposit. However, $200 needs to be available on the next business day after the day of deposit, and I do believe that continues to make $200 available each sequential day. That may be discussed further here. The first $5,000 of in-person deposits into the payee's account of checks drawn on Federal Reserve banks, Federal Home Loan banks, and state and local governments, and cashier, certified teller, and traveler checks must be made available on the next business day. Amounts over $5,000 must be made deposit no later than on the 9th business day following the day of deposit. Check deposits into new accounts are not subject to the other availability time schedules, nor are they subject to the $200 cash withdrawal requirement. That's interesting. Anyway, large deposits. The schedules do not apply to deposits of checks that may be held and that aggregate more than $5,000 in any one day. The first $5,000 is subject to the availability schedules. Amounts over $5,000 are not subject to any hold restrictions except that these funds can be held for only a reasonable time. An extension of up to 5 business days for local checks is deemed reasonable. The bank will have the burden of proving the reasonableness of longer extensions. The normal availability requirements for cash and electronic payments will apply to large deposits. Redeposited checks. Of course, there's nothing said about the $200 for large deposits. But you don't have to make $200 available to check deposits to new accounts. Interesting. Redeposited checks. Checks that have been returned unpaid and redeposited are not subject to hold schedules unless the check was returned for a missing endorsement and the endorsement has been obtained, or the check was returned because it was post-dated and it is not post-dated when redeposited. Extension of time must be reasonable. An extension of up to 5 business days for local checks is deemed reasonable. The bank will have the burden of proving the reasonableness of longer extensions. I don't see why in this section we're not explaining that the normal availability requirements for, an extension. I don't understand why we're not discussing in each section of these exceptions whether the items are subject to other availability time schedules or subject to the $200 cash withdrawal requirement. They are silent on that. Within large deposits, redeposited checks, and also on repeated overdrafts, and also when there is a reasonable cause to doubt collectability. So the only section which is saying that the new accounts are not subject to the other availability time schedules, nor are they subject to the $200 cash withdrawal requirements. Which would lead one to believe that for the rest of these items that $200 should be made available on the next business day after the day of deposit. That would be for large deposits, redeposited checks, repeated overdrafts, and items of reasonable cause of doubt collectability exceptions. Within redeposited checks, checks that have been returned unpaid and redeposited are subject to the hold schedules unless the check was returned for a missing endorsement and the endorsement has been obtained, or the check was returned because it was post-dated and is not post-dated when redeposited. The extension of time must be reasonable, up to 5 days. Repeated overdrafts time schedules do not apply to this account that has been repeatedly overdrawn. To be subject to the exception, an account must have had a negative balance or would have had a negative balance if the checks had been paid for 6 or more banking days within the preceding 6 months, or a negative balance of $5,000 or more would have had a negative balance of such amount for 2 or more banking days within the preceding 6 months. The account retains a repeated overdraft status for 6 months from the last overdraft, and time periods for holding funds may be extended for a reasonable period of time in such accounts, but cash and electronic funds that are subject to next day availability are not deemed reasonable. A bank will have the burden of proving reasonableness of longer extensions. items where there is a reasonable doubt to collectability